be about. So the title of this panel is Imagining a World Already Made Sustainable. So we're taking a positivist view here. And it's important to emphasize from the start. When Ian asked me to join this panel, I was very excited because I'm a huge fan of science fiction, and I think that science fiction examples like Star Trek are, I'm a Trekkie, I am. So for better or for worse, that's how I identify myself. But at one point I started to wonder, why do I like Star Trek so much as opposed to other kinds of science fiction? And it's because it paints a really positive view of our future, like unabashedly. In Star Trek, nobody's poor, nobody starves to death, nations unite despite their differences and maintain their differences, which is what makes different cultures so wonderful. We have, in the 1960s, the show was able to propose things like cell phones and iPads and computers and touch screens. And it's no coincidence that technology companies then literally invented those things. It just took them a couple decades to figure out how to do it. So if technology companies can find inspiration in the things that we've imagined, maybe we should be imagining how we want our future to be environmentally and sustainably, and then we can better find a way to get there. There's need for the kind of alarm and the doom and gloom scenario. It makes us act now, or at least that's the hope, but I think there's also a real benefit to, as you were saying, let's decide it's possible and then go from there. And we did a lot of this work starting in Edgar's workshop as well. How do we want 2030 to look? So I wanted to start, because we've gotten a good introduction to Hilairy and Dehlia's work, but I wanted to start with Tobias and Vandana. They're both science fiction writers, and Vandana is also a physicist. So if you two, whatever order you prefer, if you'd like to talk a little bit about your writing and what you write about and how you imagine our future and kind of the things that you're concerned with, I'd love to hear about that.
Hi everyone, can you all hear me okay?
No.
Hit the button.
Yes. How about now?
No.
It's the thing that keeps clicking off. Oh, that's what.
Gotta love technology.
Try that one.
There's also this thing.
That's just the chat.
Here, that one works.
Can you hear me now?
No.
Take
Is
the
this some
wireless.
magic?
Yeah.
Or this one in the meantime?
You're doing That's a lot to
Oh,
take
these
on.
mics.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Vandana, and my background is in theoretical particle physics, but since the last 10 years or so, I've been thinking about and teaching about and trying to develop transdisciplinary approaches, radical transdisciplinary approaches to teaching climate change, starting from the science and going beyond it. And I'm also a science fiction writer, and oh gosh, it's kind of hard to answer that question about the future, because there are so many possible futures, and and the purpose of art is to not be bound by a particular message. You're right. You have to let the muse tell you what it tells you. So some of the possible futures that I write about might be relatively bleak, because I want to experience that. And I feel like it's very important to be able to grieve the world that we won't have before we are free to actually roll up our sleeves and get together and work towards a world that is, that is sustainable. And so sometimes I write that way, but I also have written these thought experiments where I imagine a world that is, I don't like to use the word positive because that has so many assumptions, like what's positive to us as a culture, as a society, may be completely different. There's another culture or society might have a completely different view of what that positive is. But a world that is habitable for multiple species, including our own. So, going towards that future, assuming that that's happened, and then trying to work to understand how and what would have to change. And as Margaret Atwood said, you know, it's not just climate change, it's everything change. And I'm particularly interested in paradigms and how we are immersed in paradigms, unconscious assumptions that we grow up with and don't question. And so before we can unglue ourselves from what we've done to the world and think differently, we have to examine those paradigms. And the great thing about science fiction, I think, is that it can make the invisible visible. It can question our most fundamental default assumptions. So that's where I'm coming from.
Hi, I'm Tobias Buckell. I was born in Grenada, lived in the British and US Virgin Islands. I'm Grenadian/British, and I live in the US now. And the reason I live in the US is because in 1995 there was a very fierce hurricane season, not too dissimilar to the one we just experienced last summer, that rendered us basically homeless and moving to the States to live with my stepdad's parents. So I'm a climate change refugee, quite literally. And I've been very conscious of this from a very young age. As a science fiction writer, I write from a place of having come from the Caribbean, so some of my early science fiction and what I was initially known for are science fiction novels that bring the Caribbean peoples into literature, science fiction, and bring more diversity to it. What I'm known for, and the reason I got invited to come here, and the reason I'm part of the Year Without a Winter project is I wrote a novel called Arctic Rising, which is about what happens when the Arctic ice cap is completely finished melting. When I started writing it, the idea was that a completely ice-free Arctic was a fanciful science fiction idea, and by the time I was done writing it, IPCC was saying that that's a probability. The line you were drawing to zero was probable. So, and that is a novel that I tried to look at a realistic future, I thought. For me, it was, I hate to use the word positive, but what I thought was a feasible future given the tools we have today, and many people read it as dystopian, which is strange to me. I thought it was is one of my attempts to do sort of forecasting, not so much science fiction. With science fiction, we can choose any one of a million different probabilities. We do that for inspiration, we do that for shock, we do that to say what if, but in this case I was actually trying to forecast and play with that a little bit, although I did exaggerate sea level rises for artistic effect. And my second novel in that series, Hurricane Fever, is about heavy weather and the effects on the Caribbean and the need for sustainability and the forces of disaster capitalism that come in after a storm. Little hints of those things, which was all seems terribly prophetic given what's happened to my own, the places I grew up in, seeing them destroyed recently last summer. So that's a little bit about me. I've written 10 novels. My current novel, which I'll be signing at the East End Bookshop tonight, is The Tangled Land. I wrote it with Paolo Bacigalupi, who's also known for some grim futurism as regards to ecological futures. And that we tried to take high fantasy and talk about the tragedy of the commons from a metaphor there. And I've written 75 short stories that have been published in various magazines and anthologies.
Great, thank you. So one thing I wanted to talk about, because I think it's relevant in all of your work, is we have these scenarios about how we could fix things, and Hilairy, you kind of touched upon this. There's a certain pragmatic approach that needs to be taken at some point, and so if you guys want to respond to that, if we envision a future where we take charge now and say yes, we can achieve this. I guess for each four of you, what is the first thing that you would ideally fix? Because as we've discussed, climate change, it's kind of like when Drew was talking about cancer, it's a chaotic system. It has multiple moving parts, and we don't necessarily understand how those parts relate to each other. So what's the thing that you're most interested in this chaotic system that we've been talking about?
Okay, I'll jump in just for fun.
So I wanted to mention one thing, and I wanted to say it to you, Hilairy, and follow up, Julia, when you mentioned Star Trek, which is that I think there's a piece of this puzzle that is really important, and it has to do with what Nietzsche would call the revaluation of values. So I should be a real philosopher about it, but or you could just say with aesthetics, because a story like Star Trek, it wasn't only about all the cool gadgets and places in the universe that we could go. It also had its own vision of racial harmony. It had a vision of eating some bucket of slop that came out of a machine that people seem to enjoy. It had a vision of things that were wanted in its historical moment, and maybe they were strange or limited, but there was a picture of love between people, or maybe even between species, the sort of creatures that were on and off the ship from all kinds of parts of the universe. And I think that's maybe the most crucial thing to try to envision in any kind of a positive future. And I was really moved once again by Edgar's presentation of just sort of loving what you have in your backyard, whatever backyard that's going to be, because rather than saying what our backyard is going to look like in an ideal future, I think it's more that we need to have some kind of ability to love and appreciate, not sort of feel like we're sacrificing, back in the day we used to have that good stuff, but now we just have to make do with this. No, I think, there needs to be, instead of lobster roll, maybe jellyfish roll, a kind of way of thinking about how we're going to make do with what we have, because it will be changed. But just to say, I just want to toss out an idea that I'm obsessed with about things changing, and it has to do with blackouts. I know I've mentioned this to everyone on this panel, so I'm obsessed with blackouts. Many parts of the world live with either very little electricity to begin with rolling blackouts, or an unstable electricity grid, and are quite accustomed to making do with an enormously, probably log scale less amount of electricity than I usually use. So my first impulse was to say, this picture of the planet, maybe actually light pollution is something that people who have the money pay a lot of money to escape. So in some sort of sustainable future, I imagine what would, to my Euro-American class experience, look like a blackout. I don't think that means absolutely no energy at all, but it might seem like almost no energy compared to what I'm accustomed to consuming. And that's something that I could enjoy. Seeing stars or being able to see in the dark. It's not about depriving ourselves elements of that, but I think it's about actually enjoying things that we can't enjoy under these conditions, but that are also conducive to a more sustainable, I'll let you define what that is, but a more sustainable way of living on the planet.
So when I was thinking about this, a future made sustainable, one of the things that I did was I broke down everything that I was thinking in terms of improved sustainable outcomes. And I kind of thought that there are 5 rough categories of impacts. Okay, how we're housed, how we move stuff, what stuff we use, and what we eat, and how we make what we eat. Those are the rough 5 categories. And all of these things are governed by, when we start to talk about sustainable, we often get bogged down into how to fix each of those categories. How do we, make cars move more efficiently? How do we substitute public transportation? How do we eat jellyfish rolls instead of lobster rolls? It's easy to get bogged down in those details because those are things that you can tweak. Those are things that are real to you, that you can access. But for me, when I think about this, how to make a future made sustainable, all of those things are governed by a vision of what we expect a good life to look like. We keep talking about someone who's at the level of Moldova, or someone who's at the level of an American in terms of stuff.
I'm not picking on Moldova.
Yeah, but that comes down to a narrative, a story of what do we expect a good life to look like, right? And right now in the Western world, we're all governed by the idea of what a good life looks like that was built in the 1940s, early 1940s, which is, a two-car garage, everyone has their own room, there's a lawn, so that your child can experience nature. And if you dig down into those ideas of where they came from, they are not sort of horrific ideas in and of themselves. The idea of the American lawn came out of a desire to want to have an experience with nature. The idea of having a car is that you wanted to move around and have a job. Each of those individual things has a sort of rationality behind it. It's just that it turns out the world of unexpected consequences is we've kind of built a unsustainable world out of that. But it comes down to a story, not just fixing the individual little pieces of that. And so for me, and one of the reasons I'm excited to be up here is because the question is not how do we fix, and I have lots of ideas for how to fix any of those little categories. The idea is what is the story we're going to tell ourselves? And that's why I think actually having the science fiction writers float in here was actually really, really cool of you. Because stories are super important. And one of the things I tell people when I travel around the country and talk about why I write science fiction is that if you don't tell a story, someone else will tell a story for you. And that story might not be one you're in control of. Stories are important because, and we've got someone who studies the brain in here who can back me up on this or tell me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that MRI studies of human beings when their experience is a story is that mirror neurons light up to create sort of a virtual version of yourself reflected in what you're emulating that other person to be, right? So it is actually a way that we can actually model empathy, right? And so the reason stories are important is because it allows us to take someone else and put them into a different position.
To interrupt quickly, it has been proven that people who read novels are more empathetic.
And I really want to believe that.
Duh.
So I think that at the highest point of this, it's telling stories is really incredibly important because if you can tell a story of the future to work towards, we give people a goal, and it helps reduce the apathetic sort of instinct that you get the moment you consider dystopia. Like when you get to the end of your presentation on ocean acidification, it's hard not to feel completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of the disaster that's coming down the pipeline, and I think it's in terms of telling stories about a better future, we are able to chart a path forward that's really incredibly important if we're ever going to get out of this together as a species.
Well, I want to say that some of my best childhood memories, I was born and raised in India and lived there through my young adulthood, and I'm deeply connected in multiple ways. Some of my best childhood memories are indeed of blackouts and telling stories together during blackouts in the dark. But so indeed, I think that that point makes sense. That using how we live now, like you said, something that was designed, or envisioned in the 1940s, using how we live now as a standard for what a positive future will look like would be the first and biggest mistake. And I also want to add to what you said, Toby, was that it's not as though, I don't think this necessarily evolved the way, naturally evolved that Americans want lawns or cars. I think we have to name the elephant in the room. Let's name it capitalism. And we need to just, look at what it's done to the world. And it has basically given us the language we speak, the way we term things, the way we think about things. And so, because I'm interested in underlying paradigms, I want to mess with that. There's a story that I'm very fond of, which is of a tribe in northeastern India. They're known as the Dongriya Kund, and they live in the mountains there. And to them, the mountains are their deities. And they live really interesting lives. They live in the forest and in small villages. They have some contact with the outside world. In fact, they sell fruits and vegetables from the forest. They do a little bit of, they have gardens in the forest, a lot like Native Americans in the North and South Americas. And so the remarkable thing about this tribe is that when their forests were threatened by a mining company, they actually took the case all the way to the Supreme Court and won. And so, there's still an ongoing struggle because, the powers that be do not give up. And that's one of the things we have to recognize power structures here, because we're not going to make any changes without recognizing and shifting and destabilizing some of the power structures that are there. So, so in any case, the part of the story that I want to tell is a friend of mine who's an environmentalist who goes around with a backpack all over India. And even that word, by the way, is wrong for him because he's also a social justice activist. But anyway, he went and talked to those tribals, and they told him that after the court decision, the representatives of the government and the company went to the tribals and said, we could have given you so much. We could have given you roads and cars and television, and how can you walk away from this? How can you possibly walk away from this? And they said, well, actually, we've been to your cities. We've seen that everyone looks miserable, can barely breathe, you can't drink the water. And sorry, we don't want that. We don't want what you have to offer. And at the same time, they don't want to be cut off from the world. So they've been having over the last 3 years community discussions, asking themselves this question: what is well-being, and what is well-being for us? And if we think about it, and based on what you said, Toby, as well, that most of the time we passively accept what other people, with much fatter bank balances than us, think is good for us. We don't ask ourselves the question, what is well-being? And I think that we have to do that.
Can I say something really fast? It jumps to mind from both of your comments, this comment that I hear, if I misquote, forgive me, but that Joe McCarthy said in the 1950s, no man who has a lawn has time to be a communist. And it somehow pertains on many levels that our attachment to a certain ideal or a story or a kind of sense of what well-being is involves, first of all, a relationship to nature or the physical world or ecology, but it also, that relationship forecloses the possibility of envisioning other relationships, both to one another, economic relationships, relationships to the physical world, and we should never think that the aesthetics of nature or of kind of that way of living is outside of these very, very real power struggles, economic struggles, political struggles.
I think the question was, what do we want to see in the future? I don't remember exactly what the question was.
You could talk about that if you wanted to.
So, you probably figured out really fast, I'm a university professor, right? I tend to go into a lecturing mode, but fundamentally, I'm an educator. And I think what I would like to see for a sustainable future is that every one of my students and all of their parents and their children and their families and all the people that they interact with, that people had a conscious awareness of their place on the planet. I think that if people had a more sort of personal interaction with the world that they lived in, that we might not get to the places we're in now, or that we might have a different way of framing the conversations about what do I want versus what do you want versus what do we need, what do we think the planet needs. Those conversations would go more easily if everybody were aware of their place with the environment. And that sounds kind of pie in the sky, but I'm perpetually amazed. Remember, I teach in a big urban commuter school, at how disconnected my students are from the environment that they live in. And Edgar's discussion of his backyard kind of was a really nice illustration of what things could be like, even in the desert in Arizona. I teach environmental chemistry, and I ask my students every year, where does your water come from? And I can guarantee you that most of them will say, a faucet. They don't have a deep connection to where water in Arizona comes from. And in fact, we have a lot of water. We're a wet desert. And I feel like I've done my job if they, at the end of the year, yes, I would like them to know pH and carbon dioxide and all of these things, but if they know something about where their water comes from, their personal water, whether they put it in a swimming pool or they water their garden or they drink it, that's okay, that's a choice. I do all three of those things in my house, but I want them to know where their water comes from. And so I would like a future where people have an understanding of what the Earth system is doing for them and with them.
So in the spirit of science fiction, I imagine our future as the human race, not only existing on Earth, you know, and we've been talking about Earth all day, but there's no reason why we can't extend the idea of how we want to treat our planet to how we should and want to treat other planets that we may go to at some point. And because there are a lot of decisions to be made there, right? If we decide to create a little dome on Mars, which we will, I mean, we're going to be there in like 10, 15 years. Thank you, Elon Musk. What decision should we make about that? Because in a way, it's a fresh start. I mean, the conditions are totally different, right? But it is a way for us to decide about how to act without trying to correct for all the past mistakes as rapidly as possible. So if any of you have comments on that.
I don't think that many people are going to be there, and there are going to be a lot of people left here. I don't know. I'll just say that.
I think that going out into space without examining the mess that we've made on this planet is a bad idea. As a science fiction writer and as somebody who used to do a lot of stargazing during blackouts and other times, I love the idea of going out into space. But I think that there are other ways that it can be done than the way that I see it developing. You know, like for instance, how many people have heard of the Space Act of 2015? Okay, so this was kind of under the radar, and it was passed by Congress in 2015, which allows commercial companies to do things like mine on the moon. And there's a legal wrangle going on about it, but the point is that the language of colonialism is used in space ventures the way it was used in the 1800s about colonialism on Earth. And coming from a country that was colonized by the British for 200 years, I don't think that's the way to go, and I think that there are other alternatives, but those voices are not heard as much. So I think it's really, really important to have a more broad-based conversation about what a future in space would look like, but also to recognize that it's not an escape from the mess that we've made on Earth. If you've seen the movie Interstellar, it's pretty blatant, that message, that they don't even admit they've made a mess of Earth. They say the Earth has turned against us. So, which I found utterly jaw-droppingly appalling. But the point is that going out into space is not a solution for what's happening on Earth. You can't take billions of people out into space. So it goes to the, you know, what you said, Dehlia, about, who's going to go.
What if you don't think about it that way? What if it's just us expanding? We've always explored. Do you know what I mean? Like, if we think about how we want to explore other planets and get to know other planets, not as a solution.
Yeah. I agree. That's the part that excites me, the exploration part. Although I wouldn't say we've kind of always explored, and one has to be cautious too, because the people who came to strange lands and then colonized them were also explorers.
Yes.
So we have to be careful what kind of exploration we want. You know, we have to be clear on that. So.
I completely agree with that. And I've learned to say with a straight face that I am a faculty member in the School of Earth and Space Exploration. That is not a typical name of a school, and we talk about exploration in the most sort of high-minded way about understanding the world around us. But I think it's extremely important to recognize that just using that word places it in a first world, high economic value kind of, I have the luxury to go out and do these things. And that's a set of premises that we need to be careful about. I also, what really triggered my thinking is that NASA has this Office of Planetary Protection. And you think about that for a minute, and like, oh, that sounds good. We want to make sure we don't do anything to Mars when we go there. That is not what planetary protection is about. Planetary protection is about protecting us from whatever we find, and this premise that whatever we find is going to somehow be dangerous, toxic, whatever. It could be, but it's very much not a two-way proposition for NASA. It's all about keeping us safe, which in its own way might be fine, but it's a perspective on what's out there that isn't necessarily as holistic as you might want it to be.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't part of their act, as like someone at Rutgers was telling me, that no microbes are allowed to escape the little vacuums that we're proposing to create, right? So it's not entirely one way.
It's a spectacular soundbite. There is nothing that has gone into space and has landed on the moon or Mars that is sterile, period.
Yeah, I find it hard to believe, but
it's not.
Yeah.
They say it is, and it's not, and it's just the way it is.
Julie, we have a question back here.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you were talking about moving to space, I was thinking about as above, so below. How about thinking about, staying under the ocean? Colonizing there, I don't want to use the term colonizing because then that would be not beneficial for the lives that's already there underneath. But what's your idea in that?
It's certainly another place that we explore, and I use that term with no
Explore.
bad intentions. So.
At some level, it will be easier for us to, I'll say, inhabit Mars than it would be for us to inhabit the depths of the ocean. Actually, just the physics and the sort of atmospherics of it all are surprisingly challenging under the water. Right? Water is a perfect solvent. It is difficult to actually exist in a wet environment. Mars is dry. The world will actually be easier to deal with in a lot of ways. Yes, there's the problem of going to Mars. I'm not minimizing that. But your point is well taken, right? We actually are not very good at, with all the best intentions of going and finding out about new places, because invariably we bring to them whatever frameworks we started out with, and we want them to end up being like home, right? People used to go to Arizona to solve their allergies problems, and now it turns out we have remarkable humidity islands. There are lots of allergy problems in Arizona that didn't used to exist because everybody moved from the East Coast to Arizona and brought everything with them that they loved about their gardens in the East Coast, including their ragweed and their plants. And so now we have allergies in Arizona just like every place else. It's a big challenge.
Lon.
I have just a question and a comment. I think when we ask the question, what is the world that we envision if we have a sustainable world, the frame of reference that we inevitably fall back on is ourselves, right? We're always thinking about what is good for me, for us. And I think what science fiction does for us is that it removes us from that, and it challenges us to imagine a world that is radically different, a world that is compelling because it is awesome. It is that the idea of awe is very powerful because it makes you realize that you are one small part of something that's much larger. And when you're in a world that's very dissonant, which science fiction creates, in the works in the books that I've read, I think that's where learning begins. That's where you change your mind because you're in dissonance. And the longer you can stay in dissonance, the more you are challenged to reframe the way you think. So a lot of things that you were talking about looking at the night sky, is challenging if you have never seen the night sky. I remember the first time I saw it, it was in Aaron's backyard, and I was like, I never knew there were so many stars that I could look at because I come from Singapore. And it's a city, right? So if we see one star, we're very lucky. And normally it's just an airplane in the sky that we think is the star. And I think, why I love that you are asked to come here, the writers, is because writers create that sense of dissonance. When they create, very good writers do that for us, right? They challenge us to reimagine the world. They challenge us to in a way, to depart from our assumptions. And I think we don't do that enough as we think about, sustainability, because it's not just about, can we create a sustainable world? But it's really about, can we sustain a sustainable world? Can we continue to think about it and continually be challenged in the way we think? So I think it's fascinating because you talk about paradigm shift. And if that paradigm is not us, then what is it? And can that what be something that can move us away from our very carefully curated versions of ourselves now on social media, for instance? Because that's what we are all doing, and we are creating a sense of ourselves.
Well, thanks for that great question. I hear you about how we, as science fiction writers, many of us, we try to decenter ourselves. It's a way of walking in the shoes of somebody else, whether that somebody else is a human on Earth or a non-human on Earth or somebody elsewhere. And I think that, for instance, one of the most difficult things that I've had to do to extend from my own limited self and beyond is to write a story about space exploration from the perspectives of 3 people from marginalized communities. And I gave myself this challenge of thinking about people who are not from any background that I'm familiar with, and doing the research and then struggling with this question of whether I have the right to write about them, talking to activists and members of those communities, and then coming up with, how would you think about space exploration in the way that I know I was excited by as a child and still am, but which is completely divorced from and different from the kind of more colonialist kind of way of thinking. How would you envision that? And so what it led me to, and this was actually interestingly another project with Arizona State's Center for Science and the Imagination, but one of the places that I came to there was recognizing how much indigenous people around the world have to teach us. And this is not to fall into some kind of a noble savage type stereotype, but we know from research that a lot of people in the world who have never had that separation from nature to the point where they don't have a word for nature like we do, they have the opportunity to have experiences that we have never had. And I think it's really dangerous for us to kind of think we can plan futures without trying to destabilize our own selves. And you said dissonance, that's very important. It's also very uncomfortable, and we have to be open to welcoming that discomfort. For instance, there's a recent article in Yale 360, which is Yale University's environment site, which talks about the necessity for traditional ecological wisdom to inform scientists. There are many, many collaborations now between scientists and native elders of different tribes. For example, in Alaska, on the Arctic North Shore with scientists and native elders, Eskimo elders. In this article, one of the things they talk about is that people who are hunter-gatherers, tribes, they seem to have a sense of being able to inhabit. I'm trying to phrase this without sounding new agey, which is not my intent at all, but they can kind of extend their consciousness to other beings. They can kind of think like that other animal, or that particular ecosystem. And you have to read it. It's written. I mean, this is a Yale 360. They talk about science. It comes from a scientific initiative, but they talk about a way of being in the world and a state of consciousness that is something we have never experienced, to the point that I'm not able to be articulate about it. So I want to know what that is before I can feel like I understand the world around me, and I've been brought up in the physics tradition, and a particularly reductionist area of physics, which I love, but nevertheless I see its limitations. So I feel like, that's one reason why I went to science fiction, because there was no other way to think out these ideas and stories and imaginings, and to possess, in a sense, other minds and other beings. than science fiction. So thank you for that.
Your question and your question and comment bring mind, and yours as well bring mind to Kim Stanley Robinson's latest novel Aurora, which I mentioned briefly earlier. It's about a generation starship. The idea, a starship large enough that it has its own internal ecology and that people can live on it for many generations, for the years it takes to get at slower than light speeds to another star. And the idea is to colonize another planet, and the people aboard it have been raised with this tradition of viewing the Earth as dead, a la Interstellar, and that they've gone to restart and do things anew. And what they find is that the universe is hostile to life. We were talking about building under the ocean. It's really hard. I'm obsessed with underwater living because I used to watch Jacques Cousteau, and I lived on a boat growing up, and many people in the extended family were scuba divers. So I also lived close to one of the NASA little habitats that they placed in St. John. They placed them in, I think it was close to Keneal Bay, to live and experiment and see what it would be like to live underwater, in another environment. But the thing is, salt water is crazy corrosive, and they have to be super pressurized. It only takes 15 to 20 feet before pressure starts really messing with everything, and it is a hostile environment. So we haven't figured out how to live in a hostile environment under the water. We haven't figured out how to live in a hostile environment in Antarctica. That's a supply mission. It's not a self-sustaining environment. If you ever look at the documentaries of those, if it's a good documentary, they'll show you the massive cargo ships and the massive amount of cargo that has to be unloaded for them to dump all that stuff on there for them to live, breathe, and sustain themselves, and then the massive amount of stuff that they take away from there to make it zero impact. It's a really intensive operation. So we haven't, we don't even have domes in the desert, in the Sahara. We really haven't figured this out. So in this book, they, the 5 generations down the road, the great grandchildren of the initial explorers decide that was crazy what great grandmother decided to set us upon. We're going to turn the ship around and go back to Earth, because even a completely polluted, messed up, broken Earth is actually more survivable than an alien planet, and that we can go back and try to fix it. And when they arrive home, it is a sustainable future that they're reintegrated into. And that is the most fascinating part of the book. But as a science fiction nerd, you're geeking out on the traditional generation ship, going to another world, starting a whole new life. And Kim Stanley Robinson very much interrogates that and gives it the dissonance it deserves, because it is sort of like a complete wet dream. It's from his perspective. And I think I agree with him, even though I love generation starships and those narratives. A lot of the science fiction narratives, actually, there's a really good book called Colonialization in the Science Fiction Narrative. I think I'm getting the title right, but if you read it, it's a really good piece of scholarship about how rooted a lot of early science fiction is in extremely Victorian colonialist literature. And a lot of our traditions actually still come out from that, with the idea of colonizing another planet. A lot of the colony narratives that come out of science fiction are rooted in that unfortunate history. And so, I think Vandana and I are part of a generation of science fiction writers that's kind of like, hey guys, that are circling back around to that and pushing back on it. The other thing that I was thinking about was that, although I have that critique of the idea of going to colonize another world, and actually my favorite one is colonizing Venus, because, we still use the word colonizing, it just messes with your head, is actually in Venus 100 kilometers up. It's Earth pressure and about Earth temperature, and there's enough crazy gas on there that if you just use regular breathable air, it's a floating lifting body gas. Which means you can create your airship-powered fantasy world. But also there's a small chance there may be floating microbes. If there's a place in the solar system that has a chance of having life, it's probably floating microbes in the 100-kilometer band of Venus, because it is very much a Goldilocks area. It's the second most Goldilocks area of the solar system. However, the idea of perfecting our technologies, I think, is what makes space travel so fascinating. I think it has given us the perspective to look back on Earth as a single unique object that needs to be thought of as a single system. And I think that the technologies that come out of that exploration are going to be important to some of the visions of sustainability, such as high-powered batteries, solar panels that are extremely efficient. A lot of that comes out of the space industrial complex. And I think that those technologies are useful for us in trying to achieve sustainability.
I really appreciate that you brought up the concept that we've actually, and I'll even put it in the military-industrial space complex, has gotten us a lot of things that we would not have had before. And we can wax eloquent about Velcro, but for instance, Teflon, which, yes, okay, it's non-stick cookware, but it's also related to things that we can implant in the body that have saved people's lives, right? That technological enablement is actually going to help sustainability in the long term, but we have to think about how do we use it? What do we do with things? So there's a lot of positivity about advanced technology. I think it's an important thing to think about. Remember I said I was an astrobiologist. The potential for us to discover life on other planets is positive now, right? There are 3,000 plus known identifiable planets. Some of them are in zones that we think will be considered habitable. It's not about if we're going to discover life on other planets. There's a little statistical argument that maybe we won't and we are unique, but I tend to believe we're not. And then we're going to open up another whole set of questions, even if it's a planet that we're never going to get to, about what does it mean to no longer be alone in the universe as humans, right? We may not discover humans, we're probably going to discover microbes. But even microbes on another planet around another star suddenly are going to mess with our sense of who are we. We are, mentally the top of the food chain, and if we discover that we are no longer the only organisms in the universe, because we don't credit elephants and bacteria and dolphins the way we should, the whole world is going to change when we reach that piece of knowledge.
It could be humbling, right?
Imagine that.
And that could help with our sustainability efforts.
A lot of feudalism, there's a lot of autocracy, there's a lot of military, there's a lot of space command. What kind of governance do you guys envision for a sustainable future?
That's a wonderful question, and I think that tells us something about science fiction, that much as we might talk about science fiction being about the future, it's really about us here now, right? And you're right, a lot of science fiction and fantasy are, about kings or feudal systems or big governments in some form or the other. And I think that some of the writers who have really pushed against that are people like, for instance, Ursula Le Guin, who wrote the famous book, The Dispossessed, which was a really beautifully detailed working out of an anarchistic society. And one of the things I'm interested in is how communities can, become inclusive communities, can make decisions. And including also, we just talked about the space military industrial complex, and in fact it's quite true, as people have said, that it's given us a lot of absolutely fantastic technology. And I keep experimenting in my head and in my stories with ideas about how, if a bunch of people from a community got together and said that we need X or whatever, and then figured out how to get to that point. And if we look at the deep history of human beings have done that, and we think of advanced technology, well, yes, it's a product of modern times, but the Mayans had technology, the Egyptians had technology, how did those come up? And how would a community come up with it? And we don't even think about that, like what would it mean for us? So I think that governance is a really fascinating area to explore through story. And to think about alternatives to what we have now, to think about perhaps what I'm most interested in is consensus-based communities and how you go from local clusters to something broader, because we don't have the luxury anymore of being small in population as a species. So how would you scale that? So I wish I had a pat answer to your question. I don't, but I think maybe Toby can share.
Well, if you're just looking for book recommendations, I'm always happy to just share a title or two. If you're interested in an intersection of ecology and interesting governance, there's a really good sort of pseudo-post-apocalyptic novel that just came out by Carrie Vaughn called Bannerless. And it's about what a society might look like that has created itself and founded itself on a sustainable model after ecological collapse, political collapse, war collapse, famine collapse, and every other collapse you can think of that we might possibly face in the 21st century, and what things will look like 3 generations, 4 generations down the road as the next civilization bases itself upon the ashes of this one. And she does a really interesting, very, it's full of community, family, and it's got a lot of Hartnett. It's not, it is not typically, so there's, your typical post-apocalypse is Mad Max, V8 Mopar cars and, people wearing, leather and bashing each other's skulls in. And that's tremendously fun. Mad Max Fury Road was my favorite movie of the year that year. However, Bannerless is actually legitimately the first post-apocalyptic sort of novel I've read where I went like, this is actually a realistic vision of what we could build after an event like that. Because, the ridiculousness of Mad Max is why, if we had an oil collapse, would we be driving around in V8 Mopar cars? I mean, we would be stabbing each other for the leftover Teslas. Which is the beginning of my, the story I wrote for yours is actually my kind of, saying that Mad Max is kind of stupid. Everyone would be driving around in Priuses with the cattle head strapped to the front.
We're going to have to cut short here, but conversations to be continued. So thank you guys so much for this last panel of the day.